It appears East Germany, in part, is abandoning the governing coalition of Germany completely. So we had a poll that came out for Saxony-Anhalt, which is one of the 5 states that make up the former East Germany. It is a state of around 2.5 million people. Its capital of Magdeburg. It is one of the East German states that is not having an election this year. The last election was in 2021, and the next one will not be until 2026. So this state will not be having its legislature up for grabs in the fall of this year when the other states have it. But nonetheless, there are still polls coming out from these states, all of them. And the first major poll we've had from this state, including the newly formed Alliance Sarah-Wagenknecht, the BSV, that split away from Die Linke. We see here a very interesting development. We see a three-way race between the CDU, the AFD, and the BSW. And what's interesting to note about that is that these are all three of the opposition parties. If you take in the BSV replacing Die Linke effectively, which it appears, according to this poll at least, they are effectively doing that in East Germany as in the West. This is all three opposition parties basically at the same level, with all three of the governing parties, now the governing parties of Germany federally, not the governing parties of the state, rather, are under 5%. Now, this is very interesting because this is the first poll that has shown every single party in the current German federal government below 5% in a state. This means that if this state, Saxony-Anhalt, held its election today, none of the governing parties in Berlin would be able to achieve seats in this state. Now, it is only a state of 2.5 million people. It is a smaller East German state, but nonetheless, that is unprecedented. That has never happened. It's never happened for the SPD. It's happened for the FDP and Greens, but for it to happen to all three parties is a clear sign that the anger and frustration towards the federal government is growing, and in East Germany is getting to the point where the ruling parties in Berlin are being completely abandoned by East German voters and might not even have a chance to be competitive on the political or electoral field in many of these states much longer. Now, this is one poll that came out. This state, of course, not having an election soon, doesn't have that many, and these numbers could change. The BSV's numbers is very unpredictable. There's been a lot of rapid change because this party is new, and we don't really have solid results to confirm how much support they're actually at. But if this poll is any indicator of how the state will vote in 2 years, this will be a huge shock to the political landscape. Now, we see the incumbent party, the CDU, the party of the incumbent governor, Rainer Haselhoff, is at 28.5%, putting them closely ahead behind the AFD at 27%, 27.5%. Now, this effectively means that there is a clear right-wing majority in the state. Two-thirds, more than two-thirds, almost three-quarters of the legislature will be dominated by right-wing, center-right, too far-right political politicians. And the constellation will be for forming a coalition is very confusing in this instance because the CDU has ruled out working with the AFD, and the BSV really cannot work with either of the two. You can make up, say, maybe a populist anti-establishment coalition between the BSV and AFD, or a AFD-CDU conservative coalition. Both of those would be practical, but as of now, they have been ruled out by all the parties involved. You could have a minority government involving the BSV supporting the CDU, but the optics of that for both parties involved is just very bad. And so I think that this is one of those instances we see where these elections are important because this is going to force all parties involved to make a decision. And eventually this could break the so-called Brandmauer, the firewall against the AFD, and allow the AFD to come to power and work with the CDU. But of course that is still up in the air. Now these numbers are, for the parties involved, different for each party. Now the CDU at 28%, this is a good result for them. Of course, they're still winning. They're ahead in the state. However, this is a large drop from what they got in the last election. Now, in the 2021 election, the CDU actually won a surprise shock victory. They did a lot better in the polls than expected, mainly because of their governor, Rainer Haselhoff, who had a personal popularity. The AFD kind of blundered the election. They didn't really have the organization, and they lost a few points. But despite that, were able to maintain second place and be the clear opposition. And the other parties came in third, fourth, fifth, and sixth place, all at around 5 to 10%. Now, this state traditionally was very left-wing. The SPD was in power here during the 90s. It had voted for SPD chancellors in the 90s, and it also had a strong left-wing faction, or Die Linke, or the former PDS. But since around 2016 and the rise of the AfD, the state has shifted significantly to the right. A lot of the reason is because the AfD has posed a challenge to the CDU, and many left-wing or liberal voters have gone towards the CDU in order to stop the AfD, and in turn that has prevented these parties from growing, and also in turn meant that they are going to be losing a lot of support, even as we see here, a lot of them falling, all of them falling below 5%. And adding the Alliance Wagenknecht to the picture has basically ensured that many of the left-wing or liberal parties, Die Linke in particular, will fail to enter representation, or to enter again to the state legislature in Magdeburg. Now, this result, this poll, is of course one. Now, not every state is going to be like this. There's states like Brandenburg, for example, where the SPD is in government. The governor is from that party, and they are going to be remaining very strong for the foreseeable future. But in the most part, in other states like Saxony and Thuringia, the parties like the Greens, the SPD, the FDP, the traffic light parties of the federal coalition really have no chance at governing the states and are likely to lose a lot of representation. The FDP at the moment looks like it's going to lose representation in all 5. The Greens are looking very likely to lose representation in a few of them. They might hold on in Brandenburg but lose in Saxony or in Thuringia. It's still up in the air, but it is not a good sign for the governing parties. And even in West Germany, where the situation is a lot different, it is not that better. Now, the state of Saxony-Anhalt was actually one of the first states in Germany to swing towards the AfD. It was the first East German state that voted when the AfD was on the rise in 2016, after the reaction to the migration crisis under the Angela Merkel chancellorship and government. And so this was the first second-place victory for the AfD in the country in its history. In March 2016, the AfD scored 24% in Saxony-Anhalt. That's the record best for the state and one of their best in Germany altogether. They collapsed a bit in 2021, lost some support because the campaign, a lot of the campaign issues were not revolving around migration, rather on economic issues or climate. And so the AfD lost some support, but we see clearly here that they are gaining, as shown with the national trend, and they're also gaining despite the entrance of the Bundesrat Wagenknecht. They are gaining 6.7 points on their 2021 result with the BSV, which is taking some of the more left-leaning populist voters away from them, but still they're gaining support. The CDU suffering a huge, not huge drop, but a significant drop, 8.6%. But a lot of this is because the CDU in 2021 was able to win so big that the results here aren't really that surprising. This is actually a decent result for the CDU. The fact that they haven't fallen below this is significant, because in other places like Brandenburg and in Thuringia, they have fallen to the low 20s or even the mid-teens. And so we see basically a clear three-way race between these three parties, and really anything can happen. And of course, this state is not going to have its election for 2 years, but this poll is very interesting because it shows the clear divide between East and West in Germany, that the 3 opposition parties are all in the mid to high 20s, whereas the 3 governing parties are at 4.5%. That means that the parties that make up Germany's federal coalition, the parties that got over 50% of the vote nationwide in 2021, are only getting around 13% of the vote in this state. And so that is definitely interesting, and whatever happens in this state will be similar to the other East German states, but I wanted to just give you guys an update on the situation in the East and show you this poll, because it really highlights how significant the divide is and how East Germany is turning their back on the ruling coalition, and these parties might not even have a chance in the future. So as more polls come out for this state and others, I will cover it. Of course, the election campaign for September for the 3 East German states that will be holding elections will start to heat up here pretty soon, and that will be interesting, and I will do, of course, more videos on that. But nonetheless, an interesting development out of Saxony-Anhalt, the state that's not even voting, but nonetheless it shows that the trends that we're seeing across the country are continuing, and also the BSV is potentially going to be a major player in German politics in the future. So I hope you all like this video. Please share and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.